welcome into another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. Last time we sort of talked about grading week one of Chargers free agency, and well, Chargers free agency is kind of over now. There's not a whole lot happening. I do still think the Chargers will make some pre and post draft additions, right? The whole John Johnson situation kind of looms potentially if the Chargers want to negotiate with him. And we do have evidence last year of like Kyle Van Noy pre-draft, Bryce Callahan post-draft, of just some of the kinds of additions the Chargers could make, in April and in May, right after the draft. So I don't think anything is by any means over yet, but I do still think that this is the main Chargers nucleus that now exists, to kind of add around, right, in the draft. So this video, I wanted to talk about the Chargers' top 5 draft positional needs as we make the turn into April here in the draft. Crazy is now less than a month away. I don't know how this happens every year where just draft season goes by so fast. You start to like some of the players and they're all on other teams now. But that's just the way of the road, right? All right, so without any further ado, I do have a slideshow prepared. I'm in my Tyler bag right now, I guess. But here are my top 5 Chargers draft needs. I wanted to start the list with 2 honorable mentions. I did mention defensive tackle and cornerback, so let's talk about DT first. The Chargers probably are going to lose Braden Fehoko and Christian Covington. They haven't signed with anybody yet, but I do think as of now, both are probably unlikely to kind of return to the team. Fehoko is I don't think he's an RFA anymore. They didn't tender him or anything, so he's just kind of a free agent at this point. Don't think he's going to return, and he was one of their good, run stoppers on defense. Christian Covington, a decent supplementary pass rusher. Not that the Chargers are going to cry spilled milk over Christian Covington per se, but I mean he was a okay player last year compared to previous years. And I do think a big factor here and why I kind of list defensive tackle in particular is the injuries that existed last year. Otito Ogbonnia, the Chargers' 5th round 2022 pick, is recovering from a torn patella tendon, much like J.C. Jackson, who we'll get to in a bit. And Austin Johnson had a season-ending kneecap injury, I believe, after the Falcons game. And so ultimately, you don't know what kind of condition those 2 guys are going to be in 2022. I would say particularly Ogbonnia, who's recovering from a more drastic injury. I ultimately think Austin Johnson and the Chargers' top-line starters in Morgan Fox and Sebastian Joseph Day are going to be fine as their top-line unit, but the depth here and some of the question marks, going forward, is why this unit kind of makes the list for me. And also, look, as good as the Chargers, starters are, right? I trust in Sebastian Joseph Day and Austin Johnson, and I trust in Morgan Fox. The run defense was what it was last year. It was not pretty by any means, and that doesn't all fall in the interior. Of course, edge play and linebacker play is notable, but DT is kind of usually the most important factor in run defense, and the Chargers ranked 27th last year, gave up 144.2 yards per game. So you can sort of copy and paste that stat when we talk about edge and linebacker a little bit later on in this list, but just not pretty as a whole. And Sebastian Joseph Day is not, he was solid last year, but didn't grade as necessarily one of the elite guys against the run or one of the elite pass rushers. So I do think it's a position to mention, even if the Chargers are kind of running their top-line starters back. This is a position where I think you could use more depth. I believe after this year, Austin Johnson also is a free agent in 2024, for what it's worth. Cornerback. I put cornerback at number 6, or my second honorable mention in my list. Likely departure, probably Bryce Callahan. The Chargers, I should probably put a question mark after that because who knows, right? Bryce Callahan has not signed anywhere as of now, and maybe he's just kind of waiting until after the draft like last year. Maybe the team will sign him a little bit before the draft, but Bryce Callahan was a huge presence for them this year. From what is kind of going around, they do trust Jaw Taylor to take over as their slot corner from Bryce Callahan, and I do think that is important, but I also don't think that you should trust Jaw Taylor so much that you don't look at potentially other options through the draft. Finding a slot corner, I do still think you want to add depth there if you are not going to bring Bryce Callahan back. But we'll kind of see. That one's in the air. I don't want to say he's like definitely not coming back, but it's uncertain. So that's why I kind of just put him under likely departure for the sake of argument here. And the big one is J.C. Jackson. As an injury recovery, I have him listed here, coming back from the same injury that we just talked about with Otito Ogbonnia, torn patellar tendon. I don't think J.C. Jackson is going to start the season. I think that he's probably going to play at some point in 2022. I don't know whether that will be in September, whether that'll be in October, whether it'll be in November. He's probably going to play at some point. But what level is he going to be at, right? I think that's a big question as he kind of recovers from this rather gnarly injury, particularly for somebody who plays wide receiver or cornerback. The history of the torn patella tendon has not been favorable. So that's going to be a situation that's going to go forward, and I don't necessarily have the most faith, I guess, in J.C. Jackson as he recovers from this injury, but, just given the track record, but you do hope for the best. But this is sort of a situation where it's like, look, you kind of still have to add more bodies into this cornerback room exactly for this reason, right? Yeah, you have Asante Samuel Jr., and yeah, you have Ja Taylor, but if J.C. Jackson isn't going to play for a month or two during the season, you kind of still need to load up on depth. And so that's a big theme of why cornerback, while it didn't crack the top 5 for me on this list, is still here as, the highest honorable mention. And then, of course, we have to talk about Michael Davis. I do still think the Chargers can extend him in this offseason, right? I would like the Chargers to extend him in this offseason. He fully deserves it after his 2022 performance, but that's far from a guarantee. So, at this point, maybe as the Austin Ekeler thing kind of that situation plays out, the Chargers can pivot to Michael Davis and extending him as sort of like the next guy to get paid relative to Austin Ekeler if they're still far apart in negotiations. But as Michael Davis currently stands as a 2024 free agent, if he has another great year, there's going to be a team that pays him money. And the Chargers, functioning on their salary cap currently, aren't the team that can really pay him money right now, just based on how things are set up in 2024. So the earlier you probably extend him, probably the better. But I also understand why Michael Davis would kind of want to play the season out and potentially play himself into a much better free agent market this year or next year than this year was. So, we'll see. But for me, the fact that you have J.C. Jackson status for 2024 or for 2023 and the future up in the air, the fact that Michael Davis's future after this season is up in the air, is kind of why cornerback has to at least be an honorable mention. Number 5, I'm going to put tight end here. The Chargers probably don't have anyone leaving for tight end right now. They're running it back with Gerald Everett, Donald Parham, and Trey McKitty. Here's the thing. Injury history, Donald Parham has missed 20 games in the last 2 seasons. This is not necessarily his fault, right? Of course, he's just ended up on IR, got really unlucky a couple of years ago in the Chiefs game, then missed the rest of that season. And had a couple just nagging injuries last year that caused him to miss time. But Donald Parham, I think because of the time missed, kind of got the deal in free agency that he did, right? The 2 years, $2.65 million. I think that was more of a statement that was about his availability rather than his potential, because I think a lot of teams look at a 6'8" tight end and are like, yeah, we'd like to have that on our team. How much are you willing to pay? I don't know. Right? Because ultimately, Donald Parham put up 130 yards last year, 197 yards the year before that. I think everyone thinks he's a solid player, of course, when he's able to be on the field. But, availability kind of in some sense is your best ability, as corny as that quote is. And Donald Parham just hasn't been available. So how do you kind of go into 2023 relying on him as your tight end too? And Brandon Staley actually talked about this position specifically at the owners' meetings this week when kind of asked about the tight end room as a whole, right? They trust Gerald Everett, they trust Donald Parham, they trust Trey McKitty, but they're still looking to add, right, at this position. And ultimately, tight end has been kind of up and down for them, as Staley said. Specifically, he said up and down in reference to the blocking, which, as he said, needs to get better. And so, this is why if the Chargers wanted to use a first-round pick on somebody like Michael Mayer, even though I'm not like thrilled with him as an athlete, he's an awesome tight end blocker. And if they wanted to do that, like I couldn't hate on it personally, because of just what he would add to the tight end room. You have someone like Dalton Kincaid who would obviously add, top tier tight end play in a little bit of a different way than say Michael Mayer does. But I think the Chargers are going to keep their options open when it comes to tight end. I do think ultimately you have Gerald Everett and Donald Parham on the roster to start next season, and then we'll see if they draft another tight end. I just can't imagine them going through this draft, particularly with this stacked of a tight end class, and not coming out with somebody. So I do ultimately think the Chargers add in the tight end, whether that's in the first round, the third round, fourth round, I don't know. But at some point, just based on Staley's comments and just based on them running back this tight end room, I do still think they want to look to improve the position. So that's why I have it at number 5 on my list, even if it's not necessarily like a chronic need for the team. Number 4, I have safety. Main departure here is that Nasir Adderley retired. It was kind of figuring to be more of a rotation piece, right? Anyway, as Alohi Gilman kind of already usurped him as the starter. But to me, that's not the mainline story here. The Chargers, obviously, per many reports, were interested in John Johnson. They could still be interested in him, like I just mentioned earlier, pre- and post-draft potential signing there. What's their trust level in Alohi Gilman, right? I mean, I think Alohi Gilman, for the most part, came into 2022, played fine in relief of Nasir Adderley when the Chargers coaching staff kind of had no choice but to bench him. But ultimately, it was a serviceable level of tight end safety play, right? And so do they want someone who can be like a true running mate to Derwin James, or just someone who's going to kind of stabilize the unit, right? That's sort of the question as far as like, I guess bringing Alohi Gilman back in a starter capacity, or is he going to sort of be in a rotation role, right? So that would be a big difference either way, depending on what they decide to do with John Johnson, or if they sort of decide to not go after John Johnson, depending on how far apart the two are on salary negotiations and all these things, right? Do they go through the draft, right? There are some, safeties in this class that I don't think are worth necessarily being in like their first top 100 selections, but I also wouldn't be surprised if the Chargers went after a safety either. Although, worth pointing out, they still have JT Woods on the roster, depending on what they want to do with them, depending on what they want to do with him. I don't know. But I do still think that you kind of look at this safety group and there is a lot of questions aside from Derwin James. And then when we talk about Derwin James, is he going to have green dot duties next year, right? As Staley's primary play caller. Right now, it seems like the answer is no, right? I do think they want to let Derwin James operate in a way that is more of that like heat-seeking missile kind of guy. They signed Eric Kendricks probably to play green dot for a reason. If they sign John Johnson, he could also potentially be green dot. But I do think they want to let Derwin James cook, if you will, and have him all over the field and be that Swiss Army knife of sorts, whereas if he's the primary signal caller, he probably doesn't have quite as much freedom in Staley's defense. So I do think they probably want to give someone else the play calling duties after Staley sort of like took them away, so to speak, last year. And I do think he trusts Eric Kendricks more in that capacity. So I'll be curious just to see how the Eric Kendricks addition impacts the defense as a whole, but also impacts, how they're able to kind of more freely utilize Derwin as a non-play caller. So a lot of questions in the safety room. I do still think they can afford to add somebody, whether that's in free agency or the draft. But overall, I have safety at number 4. Number 3, running back. This is the big storyline of the Chargers offseason. Austin Ekeler, right? Obviously wants a new contract. Him and the Chargers still far apart. Files in that trade request. Right now, the Chargers actually don't have any likely departures from this room, right? They're going to get probably, I don't want to put anything definitive on this, but Austin Ekeler's probably coming back next year. Right, as he said in his Greenlight podcast interview, if he's not able to generate the contract that he wants on the trade market, if he's not able to do some of the things that he wants to regarding an extension, then he would, worst case scenario, run it back with the Chargers in 2023 and just play out his contract and enter free agency next year. So we're not ever going to hit like a Melvin Gordon situation with this, but there's still the possibility that Ekeler is traded or that the situation could potentially worsen. Although I think things still are very amicable right now, even as the sides are far apart negotiations. So I do think you bake Austin Ekeler into the Chargers 2023 formula, right? I don't think he's going to go anywhere. So for now, this number 3 placement is under the assumption that Austin Ekeler is still probably the starting running back in 2023. Obviously, if Austin Ekeler were to get traded or he leaves or something happens, right, like then this can go higher up the list, or, you know, depending on if they give him an extension, it probably slides a little lower down the list, right? So a lot of things could still happen, but for me, I find this happy intermediary at number 3 where you can just sort of put it in the middle. 2024 free agents, Austin Ekeler and RB2 Joshua Kelly are free agents in 2024. Crazy to think Joshua Kelly's already been here for almost 4 years. Where does the time go, huh? You have Ekeler's contract situation as a whole. Like I just mentioned, that's going to be one of the main storylines of this Chargers offseason that's seemingly going to drag on for quite a while. And then you have Isaiah Spiller. Isaiah Spiller was obviously the team's 4th round pick last year. And what is the trust level in Isaiah Spiller? What do they want him to be in 2023? I think that's one of the main storylines that doesn't quite get enough attention. I think there's some people that would like categorize him in the breakout year candidate category, but the Chargers, you know, he still was one of the youngest players in last year's draft. The coaching staff, I don't think trusts him in the capacity of like putting him in yet. You know, got obviously a couple snaps in the Niners game, got a couple reps during the period where like every running back on the roster was hurt, including Joshua Kelly last year. So he did get some time to shine. But as of now, I don't think that the Chargers really trust Spiller to be their RB2 going forward. And the production was okay. Like, it was fine, but still missed 4 games, had about 287 rushing yards, 101 receiving yards. But it wasn't, it was sort of an improvement from a Chargers RB2 standpoint and what they've had behind Austin Ekeler the last few years. But it still wasn't great, right? So do they trust Spiller to take up some of that space this year? Do they expect him to kind of break out? Those are questions that I guess we'll ask around training camp. But to me, neither Isaiah Spiller nor Joshua Kelly should prevent you from drafting another running back to either support Ekeler or potentially supplant Ekeler in 2024, depending on what happens. And yeah, as I said in my last bullet point, the Chargers, I think while the RB2 position got better, like I just said, still have pretty limited production behind Austin Ekeler, and not production that I am willing to rely upon as the Chargers head into 2023. So that's why I have running back at number 3 on my list. I cheated. Linebacker and edge tied for 2 on my list. I really couldn't decide to put one over the other. And so, yeah, your likely departures here are Drew Tranquill and Kyle Van Noy. Drew Tranquill at linebacker, obviously going to the Chiefs. Kyle Van Noy, I put a question mark. He's sort of in the Bryce Callahan category where the Chargers could bring him back potentially next season, depending on how the draft plays out or depending on what their draft plans are as a whole. But right now, that's uncertain. And then I think the most important thing, and sort of why I also grouped 2024, why I grouped these positions together on this list for next year also, 2024 cap crunch is going to be huge. We already talked about this, I guess, with Keenan Allen and Joey Bosa and Mike Williams and Khalil Mack regarding those restructures, right? But Eric Kendricks, the Chargers can save $6 million by cutting him next year. And you talk about the money that they could save by cutting one of Bosa or Mack as well, in addition to one of Williams or Allen, whom we'll get to in a second. And so the uncertain future at these positions as to who the top line starters are going to be is a huge reason why I would put them here. And then also, in addition to the top line starters potentially not being here for long, depending on what they decide to do with those contracts next year, you can't trust Kenneth Murray to even be your linebacker 2 this year, and you're probably going to turn down the 5th-year option on him. So you're certainly not trusting him to be your linebacker 1 next year. And right now, Chris Rumph, despite showing some flashes in the preseason, is nowhere near being a starting edge player right now. And I think even as far as this season goes, bringing Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa back, hopefully both healthy, especially Bosa, Chris Rumph shouldn't be able to start a game for one of those guys. Like, he just shouldn't. He's shown some flashes in the preseason, and I'm not saying that hasn't been, like, impressive in and of itself, but, like, you just can't trust him at this point to really get to the quarterback successfully or even play the run. So for me, I that's one of the reasons that both of these positions are up higher on the list for me. Can be some pre and post draft signings, right? The Chargers have a history of adding linebackers and edges, particularly under the Staley administration. Before and after the draft, you had Kyler Fackrell at linebacker a couple of years ago. Kyle Van Noy, obviously, last year as a sort of pre-draft addition a couple weeks before the draft. So the Chargers can still add in that way as well. Of course, we have the draft coming up, and this is presumably like a pretty good linebacker class, I think, relative to what the last couple ones have been. I still don't know if Staley values linebacker enough to draft one particularly high, but I would understand if the Chargers took a linebacker in their top 100 picks, because I think they need the depth right now, and I also think they need the direction whether Kendricks is here next year or not. So ultimately, both of these positions are kind of at interesting times where they're in this run it back position, and the addition of Kendricks for this year, but the future of the starters at those positions, very, very uncertain as we sit here today, which is why I sort of tied linebacker and edge for number 2. Sorry, I cheated. Number 1, wide receiver. I really didn't want to go anywhere else on this list. Now, I wrote an article for Boltbeat where I talk about the positions that the Chargers needed depth the most. And I didn't include wide receiver necessarily on that list because I think the Chargers need more than depth. I think that the Chargers, they have 3 wide receivers on the roster right now, in Keenan Allen and Mike Williams and Joshua Palmer. And with, I sort of also wrote that article, I believe, before the Chargers did their restructures. Now that the Chargers have done their restructures, one of Keenan Allen or Mike Williams, in the same way that we talk about one of Joey Bosa or Khalil Mack, probably isn't going to be on the roster next year. And I think the Chargers have to start preparing for that reality. And even before we get to that, DeAndre Carter is now a Las Vegas Raider. Jalen Guyton tore his ACL last year. Or do the Chargers have much interest in bringing him back? What's his medical status? So right now the Chargers have 3 wide receivers on the roster who, I think if you trust Keenan Allen and Mike Williams as your number 1 and your number 2, but they also haven't been able to stay healthy. You don't have any depth. And the reality is that this wide receiver room is eventually, at some point, going to receive a pretty big makeover. And right now, the Chargers really don't have the need for speed. They have the need for speed, I should say, in their wide receiver room, but they don't have speed. And so for me, you have to add that at some point in the draft. And I think the Chargers are realizing with the receiver room right now, and probably realize that they should have added in the draft last year when it comes to the wide receiver position, but they realize that they need potentially multiple guys in this draft. It wouldn't shock me if the Chargers went with a wide receiver in round 2 and also went with one in round 6. There's also, still the potential for bringing Jalen Guyton back if they want to do that. But to me, if you want to get 2 cheap 4-year rookie receiver deals out of this draft, a 5-year rookie receiver deal, if you do take one in the first round per se, this is kind of the year to do it. And then that also kind of leaves you in a better position for next year where maybe you could still draft a wide receiver in the first round if you really wanted to when one of Keenan Allen or Mike Williams does leave regarding the 2024 cap crunch. But drafting multiple wide receivers this year would also help you out in preparing for the future, in addition to addressing the present. Because right now, the Chargers need somebody like Zay Flowers. They need somebody like Marvin Mims. They need somebody who, like Trey Palmer, if you want to add him into that discussion. They need somebody who's going to be like a top 75 player in this class at the wide receiver position. And right now, they have that need on the roster. And I'm scared for this draft in terms of them not addressing that need as properly as they should because of, going after, best player available and doing all that kind of stuff and looking at the draft boards too much. Because right now the draft boards have somebody like Marvin Mims a lot lower than he should be, right? So maybe you could technically get better value in the second round, but he's also one of your biggest needs, right? And fills one of your biggest needs and is really athletic, right? So for me, I do think the Chargers need to add at wide receiver as it currently stands. That's obvious based on the fact that they only have 3 on the roster, but I do think there are some really big macro questions coming up with how Kellen Moore is going to run the offense this year and the need for wide receiver in that capacity. And then, of course, as we go forward, what's going to happen in 2024 and how this group probably gets blown up in some capacity. And then even looking at 2023, you need better depth because of the fact that Keenan Allen and Mike Williams haven't been the healthiest players, right? The reality is that DeAndre Carter had to step in as wide receiver 1 some games. The reality is that Michael Bandy had to step into a playoff game. And now he's playing in the XFL. So hopefully Chargers realize that they needed to address their wide receiver depth better and address their wide receiver room better as a whole. So that's why I have the wide receiver room at number 1. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. What are your top 5 draft positions that the Chargers need to go get? What are the top 5 biggest holes on this roster? As always, subscribe, like the video. Love you guys. This has been an episode of Bolt Breakdowns. And as always, bolt up.